You drop your phone. Not for the first time. This time it lands directly on tile. The sharp, dry thud, like ice crunching under a heel, makes your heart skip a beat. You pick up the device expecting a spider web of cracks. But the screen is intact, smooth, unharmed. You don't even wonder why. You just assume that's how it should be. But behind that assumption lies a story almost no one knows. A story of glass created long before you ever held a smartphone. Glass that was invented, rejected, forgotten, and only saved because one person couldn't tolerate scratches on a screen. This glass, now known as Gorilla Glass, covers the screens of over 8 billion devices, from smartphones to the windows of the International Space Station, though it was originally intended for car windshields that never received it. Imagine, you create a material capable of withstanding a hammer blow. It doesn't scratch, not even with a diamond. You dream it will save lives in cars. But the industry rejects you. Not because the glass is weak, but because it's too strong. In 1962, Corning engineers developed Chemcor, glass strengthened by an ion exchange process, twice as strong as regular glass. Imagine a crowd, larger people enter, and everyone has to shift to make room. That's how sodium atoms in the glass are replaced by potassium, denser, heavier, stronger. The glass becomes armor. It resisted diamond scratches and impacts that would crack standard automotive glass. But in 1968 crash tests, it didn't break predictably. It shattered sharply, sending large, sharp wedges of glass flying. In an era where safety was measured not by strength, but by controlled destruction, Chemcor became too dangerous, and therefore unnecessary. Files labeled Chemcor gathered dust in Corning's basement next to 1971 coffee cups. But this story didn't end in dusty files, because in 2007 the phone rang from Cupertino. A man named Steve Jobs, whose name became synonymous with technological perfectionism, said, "I need glass that doesn't exist yet." He demanded a screen that wouldn't scratch from keys in a pocket, at a time when 90% of the world's smartphones still used plastic that would get cloudy in a week. Corning, in 6 months, resurrected technology forgotten for 45 years. You hold this marvel in your hands every day, and it's direct proof great ideas don't die. They wait. They wait for their time. They wait for a person who will say, "Yes, it's possible." And when he says it, the world changes. 1962. Corning Laboratory. Outside, the race to space. Inside, silence broken only by the clinking of glass plates and the hiss of molten salt. White lab coats, gloved hands, and one crazy experiment to make glass stronger than steel, without metal, only from sand, soda, and scientific obsession. Engineers immerse thin sheets into a bath of molten salt at over 400 degrees. And the dance of atoms begins. Sodium leaves, potassium enters, larger, heavier, stronger. The atoms compress like a spring, charging the surface with 1,000 megapascals of stress. Imagine, it's like an automobile is placed on your fingernail, and it doesn't crack. Chemcor was born not in a presentation, not in a patent, but in that hiss, in that clink, in that silent triumph of people who believed. Glass can be armor, but here's the paradox. When car manufacturers saw Chemcor, they didn't gasp in awe. They frowned. Yes, it withstood a hammer blow. Yes, diamond scratches left only a trace, not a wound. But in an accident, everything went wrong. Ordinary windshields shattered into thousands of dull fragments like the sugar crust on creme brulee. Chemcor held until the very last moment, and then, snap. With one sharp crunch, it released sharp wedges, ready to cut flesh. Safety standards demanded predictable destruction. Chemcor offered an honest fight, and lost. Not from weakness, but from an excess of strength. Imagine being an engineer in '62. You've created the future, and the world says, "Thanks, but no thanks." Not because you made a mistake, but because you were too early. And then Chemcor faded into the shadows. Not into the trash, not into disgrace, but into the archives, neatly packaged, labeled experimental. Samples were put into boxes, files, onto shelves. Next to them, empty coffee cups from 1971. No one knew that this failure would become the foundation for a world where everyone touches a screen 300 times a day. No one knew that glass, rejected for its strength, would one day save billions of eyes from scratches, cracks, and disappointments. Do you know that feeling? When the best thing you've created the world simply isn't ready to accept. Remember, sometimes an idea doesn't die. It just waits for its time, its person, its screen. 1968. Detroit. Test track. A car with a Chemcor windshield speeds towards a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour. Corning engineers stand at a distance, hearts beat in sync. With the brakes, they know this glass has withstood hammer blows, diamond scratches, hail the size of cherries. But now everything is different. Now it's not strength that matters. Now it's how it breaks. A sudden crunch, not a crack, not a clink, a crunch, as if ice under the weight of a step. The glass does not shatter into 1,000 dull fragments as it should. It holds until the very end. And then, snap. One sharp fracture, and wedges fly out of the frame. Sharp, long, ready to tear flesh. The engineers' faces darken. One by one, car manufacturers close their doors. Not because of the price, not because of the complexity, but because Chemcor behaves like a wild beast in a safety cage. It does not obey the algorithm of destruction. And in 68, safety is not strength, it is predictability. And Chemcor violates it. Even General Motors, the giant that brought the future to the roads, writes in a report, "Unacceptable risk in a side impact." Imagine you've created glass that doesn't break, and you're rejected because it breaks too badly. And here's the irony. NASA, yes, the same ones who went to the moon, also tested Chemcor for portholes, for spacesuits. The glass passed vacuum, thermal shock, micrometeorite impacts, but it never flew into space, not because it couldn't withstand it, but because there was no market. Without mass application, there's no point. And glass capable of saving an astronaut from cosmic dust remained in folders marked reserve. Do you know that feeling? When your idea is too strong for its time? Chemcor went into the archives, not as a failure, as an unanswered question. Where to use glass that is too strong for cars, too rare for space, and too expensive for windows? There was no answer. Because the world where billions of people would poke their fingers at a screen thinner than a fingernail did not yet exist. But it was coming, and in it, every touch had to be clean, every scratch, a betrayal. And then the glass, forgotten in the basement next to empty coffee cups from 1971, suddenly became the only one who could save this new world from scratches, cracks, and disappointments. Time erases not only faces, but breakthroughs. Files labeled Chemcor gathered dust in Corning's basement, year after year. Engineers retired. Labs were repurposed for fiber optics, for liquid crystal displays, for everything except the glass that wouldn't break. The world lived in the era of plastic. Phones had buttons. Screens were thick, matte, unassuming. Scratches? That was normal. A screen wasn't a mirror. It just showed the time and a number. Why should it be clean if hardly anyone looked at it? Did you ever hold a Nokia 3310? Remember how after a week the screen would be covered in a network of tiny scratches from keys in your pocket? It was a map of your journeys, a map of your life, in scuffs. And no one complained. Because no one knew it could be otherwise. There were no touch screens. There was no finger gliding across the surface like ice. There was no demand. I must see my reflection in my phone screen. And if there's no demand, there's no market. And then Chemcor was just a beautiful mistake. Too strong to be needed. But here's the paradox. Technologies don't die. They wait. They wait until the world catches up to their dream. And in 2007, the world finally reached out a finger to a screen. Literally. The touchscreen interface changed everything. Now the surface had to be smooth, hard, transparent. Not just a display, a mirror. And then someone remembered, we have glass that doesn't scratch, not even with a diamond. It had slept for 45 years. But it woke up at the right moment. 90% of the world's screens were plastic, cloudy, fragile, doomed. And only one person couldn't accept it. Steve Jobs looked at the iPhone prototype and saw, in a week, it would look used. For him, a device wasn't a tool. It was a work of art. And a scratch on it wasn't a defect. It was a betrayal. He didn't ask. He demanded. He called Corning and said, "I need glass that doesn't exist yet." And he added, "It needs to be ready in 6 months." Imagine, you're an engineer at Corning. You're asked to revive a technology your colleagues buried in 1971. You leaf through yellowed reports. You see formulas no one has checked for half a century. And you realize, if you fail, the iPhone will look like all the others. But if you succeed, the world will forget that screens could ever scratch. Do you know that feeling? When the future depends on a dusty folder in the basement? When everything you hold in your hands is a miracle born of failure? Look at your screen. It's smooth, clean, flawless, because someone once refused to settle for scratches and woke up the glass that had slept for 45 years. A Cupertino office. Spring 2007. On the table, an iPhone prototype. Steve Jobs runs his finger across the screen. He frowns. "It scratches," he says, and it's not a comment. It's a verdict. He demands glass, not plastic, not composite, glass. Perfect, unscratchable. His team whispers, "It doesn't exist." But Jobs doesn't believe in "doesn't exist." He calls Wesley Wilkes at Corning and says, "I know you made this glass in '62. I need it, now." In his voice, it's not a request. It's an ultimatum. The future already exists. It just needs to be pulled from the archives. Corning initially refused. Chemcor was a ghost. Formulas had yellowed. Production lines had been repurposed for fiber optics. But Jobs insisted, "You'll do it, because I know you can." And then Corning agreed. The terms were like a battle. 1 million sheets of 0.8 millimeter thick glass in 180 days. No excuses, not a single day overdue. The project was codenamed Project X and given the status, above all else. Engineers put on their gloves again. They turned on the molten salt baths again. They listened again to the hiss of atoms changing places. In 6 months, the team scoured basements, deciphered records, restored the process. Chemcor returned, but now it was called Gorilla Glass. The glass rejected by the automotive industry for its excess strength was now compressed to the thickness of a petal. And when the first samples arrived in Cupertino, Jobs took a key, ran it across the surface. No scratches. He smiled, because he knew the world would never be the same. Gorilla Glass erased the boundary between finger and pixel. You weren't touching a screen. You were touching reality. Imagine, you're an engineer at Corning. In your hands, a dusty folder. And in it, the fate of billions of devices. You're not just making glass. You're bringing a dream back to life. A dream buried in 1971. And all for a man who tolerates no compromises. Today, Gorilla Glass isn't just a brand, it's a standard. Every time you drop your phone and the screen remains intact, you're touching history. A history where science, stubbornness, and vision converged in one fragile but unbreakable moment. You hold a miracle, born of failure. And it's silent, because true heroes don't shout. They just don't scratch. June 2007. You're standing in line at the Apple Store. Your feet are tired, but your heart beats faster. In your hands, a box with the first iPhone. You carefully take it out. It's heavy, 135 grams, almost like a small brick of the future. But you don't feel the weight. You feel the surface, smooth, cold, alive. You run your finger across it, and you realize this isn't plastic. This is glass, real, invulnerable. Before this, 90% of smartphones were covered with soft polycarbonate, which in a week turned into a matte whiteboard for your life's notes, keys, coins, pockets. Everything left a mark. But here, no scratches, no clouding, only purity, only the reflection of your face. At this moment, you're not just buying a phone. You're touching the digital age for the first time, and it responds with flawless smoothness. Why did Gorilla Glass become the standard? Because it won where plastic failed on 3 fronts. First, scratches. Sodium atoms in the glass were replaced by potassium, like in a crowd when larger people enter. Everything compressed. The surface became stressed, like a taut string, 700 megapascals of compression. Enough for a diamond to leave only a trace, not a wound. Second, transparency. 4 to 5% clearer than plastic. Under the sun, the screen doesn't glare, it shines. Third, thickness. 0.5 millimeter, thinner than a fingernail, but stronger than steel. Competitors looked at the iPhone 6 months later and saw the same glass, without scuffs, without disappointments. They had one choice: run or disappear. By 2010, 1 in 5 smartphones in the world already carried this glass. And then, every second. Then, almost every one. Imagine glass rejected by the auto industry in '68. Today protects over 8 billion devices. 8 billion. More than there are people on Earth. It covers not just your smartphones. It's in the cockpits of Boeing 787s, in Mayo Clinic operating rooms, even on the International Space Station, where it withstands micrometeorite impacts and temperature swings from -150 to +120 degrees Celsius. Technology deemed too dangerous for cars because of sharp shards in an accident now flies in a vacuum. Irony? No. It's just time finally catching up to a dream. You hold not just a screen, you hold a resurrected miracle. Glass that slept for 45 years in dusty folders and woke up to become the skin for a new world. And every time you touch the screen without fear, you participate in this epiphany. Because the future doesn't arrive loudly. It just doesn't scratch. You're on board the ISS. Beyond the viewport, a black abyss, strewn with the diamond dust of stars. But right in front of you is a touchscreen display with life support systems. Its surface isn't just glass, it's Gorilla Glass, the very same that gathered dust in Corning's basement under the label Chemcor, project closed. Here, in a vacuum, bombarded by micrometeorites at 28,000 kilometers per hour, it doesn't crack, it doesn't fog, it doesn't fail. Or imagine an operating room in Tokyo. A surgeon in gloves touches a sonogram screen. No glare, no scratches, no second of delay. Only clarity, only trust. What began as an attempt to strengthen windshields for Cadillacs now saves lives. In space, in hospitals, in your pockets. Since 2007, this glass has gone through 7 generations, 7 battles, 7 evolutions. The first survived only 30% of drops onto sharp corners. The second became 20% thinner and appeared on the first tablets. The third learned to withstand up to 50 scratches without losing strength. The fourth withstood impacts that would shatter everything else. The fifth, drops from 1.5 meters onto rough asphalt. The sixth, a pocket with keys, a sidewalk, a tabletop, and survived in 90% of cases. And the seventh, it bends. Yes, you heard right, at a right angle, 200,000 times, without a single crack. This isn't glass. It's a living organism that learns from your every fall. And here's the paradox that makes your heart stop. Chemcor never made it into a single car. Not one. Not in '68. Not later. The auto industry, for which it was invented, rejected it, not because of weakness, but because of strength. But this very failure spawned an empire. The digital age, which didn't exist in 1962, became the perfect environment for glass born for the roads. It's as if the steam engine was invented for interstellar travel, and only 100 years later found its use in trains. Imagine, you're holding not just a screen, you're holding a mirror of time, a reflection of how an idea, born too early, can wait, 45 years if necessary, until the world grows up to it. And when that happens, everything changes. Not gradually, instantly. You touch the screen, and you touch the future hidden in the past. The 1962 engineer and the 2007 Steve Jobs never met, but they held the same thing in their hands. Not glass, but the future. One, in a white lab coat, with fingers trembling from fatigue after a night by the salt bath. The other, in a black turtleneck, with a face that read, "If this isn't perfect, I'll smash it on the floor." Between them, 45 years of silence. 45 years when the world didn't know it needed glass that wouldn't scratch. Until the finger became the interface. Until the screen became a mirror. Until Jobs said, "Do the impossible." And Corning opened the door to the basement where dust had turned formulas into artifacts. The auto industry rejected Chemcor not out of stupidity, out of fear. Fear of sharp shards, fear of the price, fear of what couldn't be put into an Excel spreadsheet. But Jobs wasn't afraid. He didn't ask the market for permission. He declared a new market and placed at its center glass that had slept for half a century. Innovation rarely wins on its own. It needs someone to say, yes. Even if everyone else says, too risky, too expensive, too early. Especially, too early. Imagine, you are that engineer. You retire in 1971. Your lab empties. Your blueprints go into a box labeled experimental. You think, well, the attempt failed. But you're wrong. Your work didn't die. It just waited. Waited for a person who wouldn't. Compromise. Waited for an era where every touch was a dialogue with reality. And when that moment came, your glass stood between humanity's finger and the fragility of the digital world. Do you know that feeling? When you've created something important and the world passed it by? Remember, failure is not the end. It's preservation. An idea sealed in a jar of time, until its hour comes. Until someone appears who says, "This is what we need," or until you yourself return to it, with new eyes, new courage, new context, because sometimes you become the savior of your own idea. 10 years later, 20 years later, 45 years later, look at your screen. It's smooth, clean, alive. You touch it without fear, without doubt, and you don't even know the name of the person whose hands created this protection. But his science and Jobs' stubbornness converged in one moment and gave birth to a standard that we now take for granted. But it could have been different. Everything could have remained in the basement. We could still be looking at matte plastic covered with a map of our daily lives. So ask yourself, maybe your idea is also waiting for its 2007. Maybe it's already in a folder marked "didn't work." But in reality, it's just waiting for its Jobs or waiting for you to become him. What do you think? Do technologies outpace their time, or is the world simply not ready to accept them? Right. Because the next Gorilla Glass might start with your comment.